Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Before we begin tonight, I want you to think about something. Think about the version of yourself you were at 7 years old, small, trusting, still learning how the world worked, and imagine that version of you spending years quietly believing you were simply less lovable than everyone else in your own house. Not told outright. Never anything you could point to and say, "There, that's the proof." Just 1,000 small moments, stacked one on top of the other, until you genuinely believed it was true. My name is Freya. And for a long time I believed exactly that. This is the story of my stepmother, Karen, and the 18 years I spent in a house where I never once felt like I fully belonged. It's a story with real pain in it, I won't pretend otherwise. But it's also, unexpectedly, a story with a great deal of laughter in it too, because the people who eventually helped me heal from all of it never once let me take myself too seriously for very long. And it ends, I promise you, in a place I genuinely did not believe I would ever reach. So settle in, get yourself a cup of tea, and if this is your first time here, do subscribe so you never miss a story. Let's go back to the beginning, to a small house in Yorkshire, and a little girl who had just lost her mother. I was 6 years old when my mother, Helen, died. Cancer, diagnosed far too late to do much about, the sort of thing that moves through a family like a slow, quiet flood, and then, one ordinary Tuesday, simply isn't there to fight anymore. I don't remember a great deal about that time with much clarity. Grief has a way of blurring a child's memory, I've learned since, softening the sharpest edges into something more bearable. What I do remember, vividly, is my dad, Richard, sitting on the edge of my bed most nights for nearly 2 years afterwards, not saying very much, just being there, a solid, quiet presence in a world that had otherwise gone frighteningly unpredictable. My Nana Joyce, my mum's own mother, became something of a second parent during that stretch, collecting me from school most days, teaching me to bake terrible, lopsided Victoria sponges in her tiny kitchen, telling me stories about my mum as a little girl that made me feel, briefly, like I still had a small piece of her close by. "Your mother," Nana Joyce told me once, flour dusted across both our noses, "was exactly as stubborn as you are. Once decided a thing, she'd not be talked out of it for love nor money. You've got that from her, Freya, and don't let anyone ever tell you it's not a good quality to have." I held on to that particular memory tightly, in the years that followed, more tightly than I think even Nana Joyce ever realized. My dad met Karen about 3 years after Mum died, at a work function of all places, and I remember, at first, being cautiously hopeful. He seemed lighter around her, in those early months, laughing more easily than I'd heard him laugh in years. Karen was polished and confident, always immaculately turned out, the sort of woman who seemed to have an opinion ready on absolutely everything before anyone had finished asking the question. She had a daughter of her own, Chloe, a year younger than me, from a previous marriage that had apparently ended badly, though nobody ever explained the details to me at the time, being far too young to be trusted with adult complications. When Dad and Karen married, I was 9. I remember standing at the back of the small registry office in a stiff new dress Karen had chosen for me, watching my father marry a woman I barely knew yet, and thinking, with the strange, matter-of-fact acceptance only a child seems capable of, that this was simply how things were going to be now. I had absolutely no idea, standing there in that ill-fitting dress, exactly how things were actually going to be. I want to be careful here, because I've thought about this a great deal over the years, and I don't believe Karen ever set out, on day one, to be deliberately unkind to me. I think, if I'm honest and fair about it, it started smaller than that, a series of tiny, almost invisible choices that, individually, could each be explained away, but that added up, over years, into something that quietly hollowed me out. It started with small things. Chloe's artwork went up on the fridge, mine went into a drawer to keep it safe, and somehow never made it back out. Chloe got a new dress for the school photograph day. I wore one I'd already grown slightly out of, because Karen hadn't had time to take me shopping, despite having clearly found time for Chloe's. At dinner, Chloe's day was asked about first, discussed at length, while mine was met with a distracted "that's nice" love before the conversation moved swiftly along without me. None of it, taken alone, seemed like much. That was, I think now, precisely the problem with it. "You're imagining things, Freya," Karen would say, on the rare occasions I worked up the courage to mention feeling left out, her voice perfectly reasonable, perfectly calm, the sort of tone that somehow made me the one who felt slightly unhinged for even raising it. "I treat you both exactly the same. Honestly, the things you come out with sometimes." I began to genuinely doubt my own perception of things, which I understand now is a particular kind of quiet damage all its own, being made to feel, repeatedly, that your own experience of your own life simply cannot be trusted. There were harder edges too, as the years went on. If something went missing or broke in the house, I was somehow always the first to be blamed, questioned at length even when there was no actual evidence pointing my way, while Chloe's explanations were accepted almost instantly, without follow-up. Chores seemed to multiply strangely in my direction, washing up most nights, hoovering the whole downstairs on weekends, while Chloe's list of responsibilities remained mysteriously short. My dad, for his part, seemed to genuinely not notice most of it, which I've spent a long time trying to understand rather than simply resent. He worked long hours in those years, building up his own small business, and I think, looking back, he'd made a kind of unconscious deal with himself after Mum died, that keeping the household peaceful and functioning mattered more than examining it too closely, that Karen's confident, capable management of everything domestic was a relief he badly needed after years of quiet grief, and questioning it too hard might risk unsettling something he'd come to rely on. "Your dad's had enough sadness, Freya," Karen told me once, catching me on the stairs after I'd tried, clumsily, to bring something up with him directly. "Don't go upsetting him with silly complaints about chores and fairness. He needs peace in this house, not more drama." I was 11 years old when she said that to me. I believed her completely. There's one particular incident from around that same age that I think illustrates the pattern especially clearly, because it was small enough to be entirely deniable and yet significant enough that I've never fully forgotten it. My primary school held an annual talent show each summer, and I'd spent weeks that year secretly practicing a piano piece I was genuinely proud of, having taught myself most of it from a book borrowed from the school library, since piano lessons had, like most extras, somehow only ever been budgeted for Chloe. On the morning of the show itself, Karen informed me, with what seemed like genuine regret at the time, that she wouldn't be able to bring me, as she needed to take Chloe to a dentist appointment that had apparently been booked for months. My dad was away on business that week, something that happened with increasing frequency as his company grew. I remember standing in the school hall that afternoon, scanning the packed rows of parents for a face that wasn't there, playing my piece to an audience that, as far as I could tell in that moment, contained not a single person who'd come specifically for me. It was only years later, helping Chloe sort through some old family photographs after Dad's heart attack, that I found a printed appointment confirmation tucked into an old diary, dated a full week after the talent show had actually taken place. I never mentioned it to anyone at the time I found it. Some part of me, even then, wasn't entirely sure I wanted the confirmation of what I'd already quietly suspected for years. I think, if you asked me to point to a single memory that captures the whole shape of my childhood with Karen, it would be my 12th birthday. Chloe's birthday, 6 weeks earlier, had been a proper occasion, a hired venue, a bouncy castle, a cake from the good bakery in town shaped like a unicorn, 20 of her school friends invited. I remember helping blow up balloons for hours the night before, genuinely happy to help make it special for her, because whatever else was going on between Karen and me, Chloe herself had never been unkind to me directly, not in those early years. If anything, she often seemed faintly uncomfortable with the difference in treatment, though she was far too young then to properly understand or challenge it. My birthday, 6 weeks later, consisted of a shop-bought sponge cake from the supermarket, a small stack of presents that turned out to be mostly practical items I'd needed anyway, new school shoes, a winter coat, and a card from Karen that simply read "Happy Birthday, love from Karen and Chloe," my dad's name notably, though I assumed accidentally, left off entirely. "Where's my party?" I remember asking, with the blunt honesty only a child manages, watching Karen wash up the breakfast things that morning. "We don't always need a big fuss for every birthday, Freya. Money doesn't grow on trees, you know, and we've had rather a lot of expenses lately." I didn't mention the bouncy castle. Some small, wary part of me already understood, even at 12, that mentioning it would somehow become my fault too. My dad came home from work that evening with a small bunch of flowers and a genuinely apologetic look on his face, clearly having only just remembered the significance of the day amid whatever crisis his business was weathering at the time. "Happy birthday, love. Sorry it's been a quiet one. We'll do something proper this weekend, promise." We did not, in the end, do something proper that weekend. Something came up with the business, as it often seemed to in those years, and the promised outing quietly evaporated, the way so many small promises in that house tended to. I don't tell you this story looking for sympathy exactly, though I won't pretend it doesn't still sting slightly in the retelling. I tell you because it's the moment I first properly understood, with a child's blunt clarity, that fairness was not something I was automatically entitled to in that house, that I would need to either accept considerably less than Chloe received as simply normal, or spend my entire childhood quietly, exhaustingly fighting for scraps of equal treatment that never quite arrived regardless. I chose, mostly, to accept it. I'm not sure, looking back now as an adult, that a 12-year-old really has any other realistic choice available to her. If this story were only about Karen, I don't think I could have got through telling it to you at all, honestly, without it feeling unbearably bleak. So let me tell you about the two people who, between them, kept me afloat through all of it. Nana Joyce remained a fierce, steady presence throughout my entire childhood, and I think, looking back, she understood far more of what was happening in that house than I ever directly told her, piecing it together from small offhand comments and the particular quiet way I'd go rather withdrawn after certain visits home. "You come to me anytime you need to, Freya," she told me more than once, usually while we baked together in her cramped little kitchen, flour dusted everywhere as usual. "This is your house too, whenever you need it to be. Doors never locked to you, love, not ever." She had a wonderfully sharp sense of humor that got me through more difficult afternoons than I can properly count. Once, after I'd tearfully described some particular slight, Chloe getting new trainers while my own had a hole worn clean through the toe, Nana Joyce simply muttered, entirely deadpan, "Well, I never did think much of that woman's taste in footwear anyway, so it's really doing you a favor in the long run, love," and had me laughing properly within about 30 seconds despite myself, the tears still drying on my cheeks. My best friend Florence, whom I met at secondary school when we were both 11, became the other constant. Florence's own home was warm and chaotic in the very best possible way, 5 siblings, a golden retriever with alarmingly little self-control, and a mother who set an extra place at the table for me so routinely that I eventually simply started thinking of it as my seat too. "You're basically our 6th child at this point, Freya," Florence's mum told me once, entirely matter of fact, sliding an extra portion of shepherd's pie onto my plate without even being asked. Might as well make it official. Florence herself had absolutely no patience whatsoever for Karen, once she properly understood the situation, several years into our friendship. "She sounds," Florence announced with total confidence one afternoon, aged about 14, "exactly like a villain from a book aimed at 8-year-olds, and I genuinely mean that as an insult to the sophistication of 8-year-old villains." That's oddly specific, Flo. I've thought about it a great deal, clearly. Between Nana Joyce's steady warmth and Florence's fierce, funny loyalty, I built myself a kind of second family entirely outside that house, one where I never once had to wonder if I was truly wanted. I think, without either of them, I might have grown into a considerably more bitter, closed-off version of myself than the one who eventually made it through. By the time I was 17, the gap between how the house treated Chloe and how it treated me had become, if anything, even wider, though by then I'd become so practiced at simply absorbing it quietly that I rarely bothered raising it aloud anymore. Chloe, by then, had softened considerably as we both grew older, and in our later teenage years we developed something almost like a genuine friendship, careful and slightly guarded on my part, but real nonetheless. I don't think Chloe ever fully understood, even then, quite how differently we'd each experienced growing up in that same house. Children rarely have much perspective on their own relative privilege while they're still living inside it. "Mum's just a lot, sometimes," Chloe said once, rather carefully, during one of the rare moments we spoke honestly about the dynamic. "I know she's harder on you than me. I've never really understood why. I've asked her about it before, actually, and she just changes the subject every single time." I remember being oddly touched that Chloe had even noticed enough to ask, though it didn't change very much about my day-to-day experience of the house. I left for university at 18 with something close to relief flooding through me, packing my entire life into 2 suitcases and Nana Joyce's ancient, rattling car, which she insisted on driving me the full 3 hours herself rather than letting my dad do it, despite her hip giving her considerable trouble by then. There's one particular moment from my final year at home, just before I left for university, that I think belongs in this story too, because it was, in many ways, the moment I finally stopped hoping things might quietly improve on their own. I'd been accepted onto a 2-week residential art program this summer before 6th form, a genuinely competitive opportunity that my art teacher had personally recommended me for, having spotted something in my portfolio she thought deserved encouragement. I remember bringing the acceptance letter home with something close to real excitement, the first time in years I'd felt properly proud of something and eager to share it. "That's lovely, Freya," Karen said, barely glancing up from the letter, "though I'm not sure we can really justify the cost this year, what with Chloe's driving lessons starting up. Perhaps next summer, once things have settled financially." Chloe's driving lessons began within the fortnight. My art program place quietly lapsed, unclaimed, the deposit deadline passing without any further conversation about it at all. I didn't raise it again. By 17, I'd learned rather thoroughly that raising things rarely changed the outcome, only extended how long I spent hoping it might. I mentioned it to Nana Joyce some weeks later, more in passing than as a proper complaint, and I remember the unusually sharp, controlled anger that crossed her face before she carefully smoothed it back into her usual warmth for my benefit. "You'll have other opportunities, love. Plenty of them, and better ones besides, I'd wager. Don't let this house convince you your chances are as limited as it seems determined to make you feel they are." She was right, as it turned out, though it would take me a good many years afterwards to properly believe it for myself. "You don't owe that house one single thing more than you've already given it, Freya," she told me firmly, as we unloaded boxes into my new halls of residence. "You go and build yourself a proper life now, whatever shape you want it to take." You've more than earned that. My relationship with my dad grew steadily more distant over the following years, not through any single dramatic falling out, but simply through the accumulated weight of years spent not quite being able to say the things that actually needed saying. Phone calls became shorter, visits home became rarer, always somehow easier to find a reason to stay away than to walk back into a house that had never quite felt entirely mine. I built a genuinely good life for myself in the years that followed, a career in landscape architecture that I'd fallen into almost by accident and grown to love properly, a small but solid group of close friends, eventually a flat of my own in Manchester that I decorated exactly as I pleased, filled with plants and books, and absolutely no shop-bought supermarket birthday cakes ever again if I could help it. I told myself, for a long time, that I'd made my peace with how things had turned out. I hadn't, not really. I'd simply got very good at not looking at it directly. University itself became, in its own quiet way, a second kind of healing I hadn't consciously gone looking for. I remember, in my first term, sitting in my hall's kitchen listening to my flatmates discuss their own families with such easy, uncomplicated fondness, parents who rang just to chat, siblings they bickered with but plainly adored, and feeling a strange, unfamiliar ache at how foreign that particular kind of ease sounded to me. I threw myself properly into my course, into new friendships, into building a version of adult life that felt entirely my own for what genuinely felt like the first time. I went home for Christmas most years, dutifully, staying only a handful of days before finding some reasonable excuse to return early to Manchester, to Florence's chaotic, welcoming family home, or eventually to my own small flat once I'd graduated and found steady work. My dad noticed the growing distance, I think, in his own quiet way, though we never once properly discussed it directly. He'd occasionally ring on a random Tuesday evening, ask how work was going, tell me some small, ordinary piece of news, and then the call would end after 10 or 15 minutes, both of us somehow relieved to have kept things pleasant and brief rather than risking anything more complicated. I told myself this was simply what adult father-daughter relationships naturally became, once a person moved away and built an independent life. I'm not sure, looking back now, that I properly believed that even at the time. I was 32, sitting at my desk on an entirely ordinary Wednesday afternoon, when my phone rang with my dad's name on the screen, not something that happened often enough by then to go unremarked, and something about the timing made my stomach drop even before I answered. Freya, love. I need you to come home. It's not good news, I'm afraid. My dad had suffered a heart attack that morning, collapsing at his desk at work, rushed to hospital by an ambulance that had, thankfully, arrived quickly enough. He was stable by the time I got the call, but the doctors were talking about significant, ongoing complications, a long road of recovery ahead, possibly further surgery required. I drove the 3 hours back to Yorkshire in something of a daze, Florence on speakerphone for most of the journey, talking me through it in the calm, steady way she'd perfected over 2 decades of friendship. You don't have to sort out how you feel about any of the rest of it right now, Freya. Just get there, see your dad, breathe. The rest can wait. Karen met me at the hospital entrance, looking genuinely shaken, older somehow than the last time I'd properly seen her, several years earlier at a family gathering I'd attended mostly out of obligation. There was an awkward, uncertain moment between us, neither of us quite sure how to greet the other after so long, before she simply said, quietly, "Thank you for coming, Freya. He's been asking for you." My dad looked smaller in that hospital bed than I'd ever imagined possible, wired up to machines that beeped with a steadiness that felt, oddly, both reassuring and terrifying at once. "There she is," he said, voice weak but his eyes properly lighting up when he saw me, in a way that caught unexpectedly at something in my chest I'd spent years trying to keep carefully shut away. My girl. I'm glad you came. Of course I came, Dad. Don't be daft. We sat together for a long while that evening, mostly in comfortable silence, and somewhere in that quiet hospital room, watching him breathe steadily beside the softly beeping monitor, I felt something in me that had been braced tight for over 20 years finally, very slightly, begin to loose. The doctors recommended several weeks of recovery before my dad could return properly to work, and without really discussing it in advance, I found myself simply staying on in Yorkshire, moving temporarily back into my childhood bedroom, working remotely from the desk I'd once done my GCSE revision at. Chloe, now 29 and living locally with her own young family, came round most days too, and over those strange, suspended few weeks, something between us properly deepened for the first time since we'd been teenagers. I never really understood, growing up, quite how hard things were for you here, Chloe admitted one evening, the two of us sitting out in the back garden while Dad napped upstairs, Karen inside preparing dinner. I think I just accepted it as normal, the way kids do. It wasn't until I had my own daughter that I started really looking back and questioning some of it properly. You don't need to feel guilty about it, Chloe. You were a child too. None of it was your doing. Maybe not directly. But I think I could have said something, at some point, once I was old enough to properly understand what was happening. I never did. I think I was scared of what it might do to my own relationship with Mum, if I'm honest. I appreciated her honesty more than I think she realized, even if it didn't undo 2 decades of accumulated hurt in a single conversation over garden chairs. It was during that same stretch of weeks, sorting through some old boxes in the loft at Dad's request, hunting for insurance paperwork he needed, that I found something that changed the entire shape of everything I thought I understood about my childhood. Tucked at the very back of an old filing box, beneath years of tax documents and old bank statements, was a smaller shoebox, tied shut with string, my mother's handwriting visible on a label stuck to the lid, for Freya, when she's older, from Mum. My hands were shaking as I opened it. Inside were letters, a whole stack of them, written in my mother's careful, looping handwriting, clearly composed during the final months of her illness, when she must have known, with whatever grim certainty terminal diagnoses eventually bring, that she wasn't going to be there to write them to me as I actually grew into each stage they addressed. There was one for my 18th birthday. One for my wedding day, whenever that might eventually come. One simply titled, "For a Hard Day, Whenever You Need It." And beneath them all, a smaller envelope addressed simply, "For Freya's 12th birthday." My hands went cold as I opened that particular one, remembering with sudden, sharp clarity exactly what that birthday had actually looked like. "My darling girl," it read. "If you're reading this on your 12th birthday, I hope more than anything that your dad has found happiness again by now, and that you have too, in whatever new family shape life has brought you. I hope somebody has made today feel properly special for you, the way you deserve every single year of your life to feel. I love you more than these words could ever properly capture, and I am so desperately sorry I won't be there to tell you so myself." I sat on that dusty loft floor and cried harder than I think I had in over a decade, understanding all at once, with a fresh and different kind of pain, that this letter had been sitting in that house the entire time, through the shop-bought sponge cake, through the forgotten party, through every quiet birthday since, never once delivered to the child it had been written for. I brought the whole box downstairs and, without entirely planning to, laid it in front of my dad, still recovering in his armchair, and Karen, who'd come through from the kitchen at the sound of my raised, unsteady voice. "Did either of you know this was up there? All this time?" My dad's face went properly gray. "Freya, I honestly didn't know, love, I swear it. Your mum must have written these near the very end, when I wasn't always in the room." I had no idea they existed. Karen, though, went very quiet in a way I recognized instantly, even after all these years apart, as the particular stillness of someone caught out. Karen. Did you know? The silence stretched long enough that I already knew the answer before she finally, haltingly, gave it. I found them, Karen said eventually, sitting down heavily on the sofa, not quite able to meet either of our eyes properly, not long after your father and I married. I was going through some old boxes, trying to make space, and I found that shoebox tucked right at the back. Why didn't you give them to me? Karen was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally spoke again, her voice had lost every trace of the crisp, confident certainty I'd spent my whole childhood being quietly intimidated by. I read the first one, the 18th birthday one, before I properly understood what I was holding. And I saw how much she clearly loved you, how completely devoted she still was to you even facing her own death, and she stopped, pressing a hand hard against her mouth for a moment. I was so frightened, Freya, of never measuring up to that. Of you always loving a ghost more fiercely than you could ever possibly learn to love me, however hard I tried. I told myself I'd give them to you eventually, when the time felt right, and then somehow the right time never quite came, and the longer I left it, the harder it became to admit I'd kept them at all. So instead you decided I simply deserved less than Chloe. Smaller birthdays. Fewer new clothes. Constant blame whenever anything went wrong in this house. That was easier for you than simply handing me a box of letters my dying mother wrote for me? My dad's head snapped up properly at that, staring between the two of us with an expression of dawning, horrified understanding. Karen. What exactly is Freya talking about? There's more, isn't there? I said, something in me suddenly, finally unwilling to let this settle for anything less than the whole truth, after 2 decades of being told my own perception couldn't be trusted. The talent show. The birthdays. The dentist appointment that never actually happened on the day you told me it did. All of it, Karen. I want to hear you actually say it, properly, out loud, in front of Dad, rather than watching him piece it together secondhand from things I half remember. Karen's composure, that same crisp, unshakable confidence I'd spent my entire childhood feeling faintly intimidated by, finally, completely crumbled. She put her face in her hands for a long moment before she could continue. I resented her, she said eventually, voice barely audible. Helen. Your mother. Not as a person, I never even properly knew her as a person, only as this constant, gentle ghost that seemed to fill every corner of this house, however hard I tried to make it feel like ours instead. Every time your dad looked at you, Freya, I could see him seeing her too, in your face, in the way you laughed, and some ugly, small part of me decided, somewhere along the way, that if I couldn't ever fully compete with a memory that perfect, I would simply stop trying quite so hard with the daughter who kept that memory so visibly alive in this house every single day. And Chloe was easier to love, because she didn't remind you of anyone you couldn't compete with. Yes, Karen admitted, and the single word seemed to cost her something significant to say aloud. I am not proud of any of it, Freya. I've known, somewhere underneath everything, for years now, exactly what I was doing, even while I kept finding new ways to justify it to myself in the moment. My dad sat there listening, growing visibly more devastated with every single example, his face a mixture of horror and a very particular kind of guilt I don't think I'd ever seen on him before. I didn't know, he kept saying, over and over, I genuinely didn't know, Freya, I swear to you I didn't know any of this was happening under my own roof. I know you didn't, Dad, I said, and found, rather to my own surprise, that I properly meant it. I don't think you were the one doing it deliberately. But I do think you chose not to look very closely at any of it, for a very long time, because looking closely might have meant disturbing a peace you badly needed after losing Mum. I understand why you did that. It doesn't mean it didn't cost me something significant regardless. The weeks that followed were, without question, some of the strangest and most emotionally exhausting of my entire adult life. My dad, once the full picture had properly settled in, went through what I can only describe as a genuine reckoning of his own, with Karen, with himself, with 2 decades of quiet avoidance he'd never properly examined. There were arguments in that house, late into several nights, low urgent voices carrying up through the floorboards to my old bedroom, that I deliberately didn't try to listen in on, feeling I'd already extracted enough painful truth from that house to last me a good while. Karen, to her credit, and I want to be fair here, because I think fairness matters even in stories like this one, did not try to defend or minimize what she'd done, once it was properly out in the open. She wrote me a long letter of her own, a few weeks later, that I've kept, somewhat to my own surprise, tucked away alongside my mother's. I will not ask you to forgive me, because I don't believe I've earned that yet, and perhaps I never fully will, she wrote. I want you to know that my jealousy of your mother's memory was entirely my own failing, not anything lacking in you, and I am more sorry than I know how to properly express for the years of unfairness that jealousy caused you to live through. I do not expect a relationship with you going forward, Freya. I only hope, whatever you decide, that you finally know now, without doubt, exactly how deeply you were loved, both by your mother and, I hope in time you might believe, by your father, who I know now failed you far more through inattention than intention. I didn't reply to that letter for a long while, needing considerable time and distance to properly sit with everything before I could decide how I genuinely felt about any of it. Chloe, for her part, was devastated on my behalf once she learned the full extent of what had actually happened, growing up in the very same house without ever fully realizing the scale of it. I am so sorry, Freya, she told me, properly crying, the two of us sitting together in her small back garden while her own daughter napped upstairs. I had no idea it went that deep. I keep thinking about all those birthdays, side by side, and I feel sick about it, genuinely sick. You were a child too, Chloe. I've said it before and I mean it properly. None of this sits on your shoulders. Maybe not entirely. But I get to choose, now, how I show up for you going forward, don't I? That part's entirely on me. My dad, in those same weeks, seemed to age visibly under the weight of what he'd learned, and I found myself, rather unexpectedly, having to actively manage his guilt almost as much as processing my own hurt. He took to ringing me most evenings, sometimes with very little to actually say, simply wanting, I think, to confirm I was still willing to pick up the phone. I keep going back over it, Freya, he told me one evening, voice rough. Every birthday I missed, every time I was too tired after work to properly ask how your day had been, every time I let Karen handle something I should have paid closer attention to myself. I don't know how to forgive myself for not seeing it. I don't think punishing yourself endlessly actually helps either of us move forward, Dad. I'd rather you spent that energy showing up properly now, than drowning in guilt about the years you can't get back. That's remarkably generous of you, love, considering everything. It's not generous, exactly. It's practical. I've spent enough years being angry already. I'm rather tired of it, if I'm honest, and I'd like to try something different for a while. He went quiet at that, and when he spoke again, his voice had steadied slightly. Then I promise you this much, Freya, whatever time I've got left, however much or little that turns out to be after all this business with my heart, I intend to spend a good deal more of it properly paying attention. To you. To all of it. I should have been doing that from the very beginning. I promise you, this story does eventually arrive somewhere lighter, because even in the middle of all that heaviness, Nana Joyce, bless her, provided exactly the kind of comic relief only a genuinely unbothered 80-something woman can reliably deliver. When I told her the full story, sitting in her familiar kitchen with a fresh, still lopsided Victoria sponge cooling between us, exactly as it had been for over 20 years, she listened in uncharacteristic silence for the entire telling, her expression growing steadily darker. When I finally finished, she simply reached across, cut 2 enormous slices of cake, slid one firmly in front of me, and announced, with total, unshakable conviction, "Well, I always did think that woman's Victoria sponges tasted slightly of resentment, and now I finally understand exactly why." I laughed so hard I nearly choked on my tea, the release of it hitting me almost harder than the tears had, days earlier. Nana, that's not remotely how flavor works. Isn't it, though? I stand by it entirely. Bitterness has a taste, Freya, you mark my words, and that woman's sponges always had a distinct hint of it. She then proceeded, without any prompting whatsoever, to recount, in considerable, gleeful detail, every single subtle dig she claimed to have secretly delivered to Karen at various family gatherings over the years, most of which I'd apparently been far too young or distracted to properly catch at the time. Do you remember the christening, when I accidentally sat her next to Great Uncle Bernard, who talks of nothing but his prostate for a solid 3 hours? That was not remotely an accident, Freya. That was a carefully considered act of quiet justice, executed to perfection, and I've never once regretted it. By the end of that particular afternoon, I was laughing properly, genuinely, for what felt like the first time in weeks, Nana Joyce topping up my tea with the satisfied air of a woman who considered her life's petty revenge portfolio to be in thoroughly excellent order. "You've always looked out for me, Nana," I told her, more seriously, once we'd both finally stopped laughing. "Somebody had to, love. And frankly, it was never a hardship. You were always worth looking out for properly, whatever that house managed to make you doubt about yourself along the way." Over the following year, my relationship with my dad slowly, carefully rebuilt itself into something genuinely different from what it had been for most of my adult life, not perfect, not without its own awkward, difficult conversations along the way, but real in a way it simply hadn't managed to be for a very long time. He came to visit me in Manchester for the first time in years, insisting on taking me to properly nice dinner, where he spent a good portion of the evening apologizing in various different ways, until I eventually had to gently tell him we could perhaps move forward now, rather than circling the same apology all evening. "I want to actually know you now, Freya. Properly. Not just the version of you that fit around everyone else's needs in that house. Tell me about your work. Tell me about your life. I've missed rather a lot of it, I think, and I'd very much like to catch up, if you'll let me." We talked for hours that evening, about my career, about Florence and her ever-expanding chaos of a family, about a man named Edward I'd recently started seeing who my dad, rather sweetly, insisted on meeting properly, and soon before the evening was through. Edward, when he did eventually meet my dad a few weeks later, turned out to handle the whole slightly nerve-wracking introduction with rather more grace than I'd expected, given that I'd warned him, somewhat apologetically, about the general shape of my family history beforehand. "Your dad kept asking me what my intentions were, Freya," in almost exactly those words, like we'd wandered into a period drama, Edward told me afterwards, laughing properly. "I don't think I've ever been quite so formally interrogated over a plate of roast beef in my entire life. That's just him trying to make up for about 15 years of not asking enough questions about anything, I'm afraid. You'll have to bear with it a while longer." Honestly, I found it rather touching, once I understood what was actually behind it. A man properly trying, late but trying nonetheless. There are worse things to witness in a future father-in-law. My dad and Edward have gone on to develop a genuinely warm relationship of their own since, the two of them disappearing for long walks whenever Edward visits, discussing football and, apparently, an ever more elaborate plan to renovate my dad's garden shed that neither of them seems in any particular hurry to actually finish. My relationship with Karen never fully repaired, and I've come to accept, with time, that it probably never will, not in any close, ongoing sense at least. We exchange polite messages now, around Christmas and birthdays, and I attended her 60th birthday gathering the following year at Chloe's gentle, careful urging, staying for a respectful hour before quietly making my excuses. It's not warmth between us, not exactly. But it's no longer the tense, careful minefield it once was either, and I've decided that's enough, that I don't owe her forgiveness on any particular timeline, only my own honest, ongoing peace with however things eventually settle. Chloe and I, by contrast, grew closer than we'd ever been, even as children, regular phone calls, weekend visits, her young daughter calling me Auntie Freya with a warmth that still catches unexpectedly at my chest every single time I hear it. Chloe has, more than once, quietly apologized again for not seeing things sooner as a child, and each time, I've told her the same thing, that the two of us choosing, now, as adults, to build something honest and equal between us matters a great deal more than anything either of us could or couldn't have understood at 7 or 8 years old. Today, nearly 2 years on from that strange, difficult stretch in the hospital and the loft and everything that followed, I sit writing this from my flat in Manchester, my mother's letters kept safely in a small wooden box on my bedside table, read now and then on the harder days, exactly as she'd once hoped they might be. My dad calls every single Sunday now, without fail, proper conversations rather than the brief, dutiful check-ins we'd fallen into for so many years beforehand. He came to my engagement party last month. Yes, Edward and I are engaged now, and my dad cried properly at the announcement, in front of the whole room, which mortified him afterwards almost as much as it delighted me at the time. Nana Joyce, 84 now and showing absolutely no signs of slowing down, has already informed me, in no uncertain terms, that she intends to personally oversee the wedding cake, and there will be no shop-bought sponge anywhere near this occasion. Freya, not while I've still got working hands and a functioning oven, I can promise you that much. Chloe is one of my bridesmaids, a fact that would have seemed genuinely impossible to me a few years ago, back when the 2 decades of quiet unfairness between us felt like far too much to ever properly bridge. The wedding itself is set for next spring, and my dad, in a gesture that undid me rather more than I expected when he first mentioned it, has asked if he might walk me down the aisle wearing a small pressed flower from my mother's own wedding bouquet, one Nana Joyce had somehow kept safe and dried between the pages of an old book for over 3 decades, waiting, she said, for exactly the right moment to hand it back into the family properly. Your mother would have been so proud of the woman you've become, Freya, he told me, holding that fragile, faded little flower carefully in his palm as though it might crumble entirely if he gripped it too hard. I only wish I'd made sure you knew that a good deal sooner than I actually managed to. You're managing it now, Dad. That counts for rather a lot, as far as I'm concerned. I've thought a great deal, in the writing of this story, about what I might say to that 9-year-old girl standing at the back of a registry office, watching her father marry a stranger, utterly unaware of the years of quiet unfairness waiting for her on the other side of that day. I think I'd tell her that it wasn't her fault, not one single part of it, however thoroughly she'd eventually be made to feel otherwise. I think I'd tell her that the people who truly loved her, her mother, her grandmother, a stubborn best friend who refused to let her disappear into her own quiet self-doubt, never once stopped, not for a single year of it, even when it felt, from the inside, like she was managing entirely alone. And I think, more than anything, I'd tell her that the family she eventually built for herself, patched together from old loyalty and hard-won honesty and a good deal of properly earned forgiveness, would turn out to be worth every single difficult year it took to finally arrive at it. I think, if I'm honest, the version of me who stood at the back of that registry office at 9 years old, watching my father marry a stranger, could never have imagined arriving somewhere quite this steady, this loved, this properly at peace. It took a very long road to get here, longer than I would have chosen, if anyone had asked me at the time. But I think, looking back now, every hard year of it eventually led me exactly to where I needed to be, surrounded finally by people who never once made me question whether I deserved to be there. And that, everyone, is my story, the childhood my stepmother made harder than it ever needed to be, and the family, old and newly rebuilt, that eventually helped me heal from it properly. I hope this one moved you, made you laugh in places you weren't quite expecting to, and left you with a proper sense of peace by the end, because that's exactly what living through it eventually gave me too. If this story resonated with you, please do give the video a like, and let me know in the comments, have you ever had to rebuild a family relationship you once thought was permanently broken? I read every single comment, and I'd love to hear how your own story unfolded. Don't forget to subscribe so the next story finds its way to you, and hit that bell icon so you never miss an update when a new one goes up. I'll see you in the next story, with a whole new family, and a whole new road towards healing. Until then, take care of yourselves, and remember, whatever unfairness you might have carried quietly out of your own childhood, you are allowed, at any age, to finally put it down.